In the year 1206, a man with no army, no kingdom, and no written language unified the most fractured people on earth and built the largest contiguous empire in human history. He came from nothing, a felt tent on the Mongolian steppe, no wealth, no title, no inheritance. What he built, he often built through brutal conquest. Entire cities leveled. Populations that resisted were destroyed. The scale of it is almost impossible to wrap your head around even today. And yet, the world that came after him looked more like our world than the one that came before. He abolished inherited aristocracy. He promoted based on merits, not bloodlines. He guaranteed religious freedom across his empire in a time when Europe was burning people alive for their beliefs. He created the first international postal system, the first free trade network stretching from China to Eastern Europe, and a legal code that applied to everyone, including himself. One man from the middle of nowhere accidentally invented globalization. The book is called Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World by Jack Weatherford. And it's the story of Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire from many, many, many years ago. To understand this, we need to go back in time to get a little bit more into the setting and the context here. So you first have to understand where he came from and who the Mongols actually were, because most people couldn't answer that today. This was so long ago. They were a nomadic people from the grasslands of what is now the country of Mongolia, landlocked between Russia and China, roughly twice the size of Texas, and home to some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. Not Chinese, a distinct ethnic group with their own language, their own customs, and for most of their early history, no written alphabet at all. When Genghis Khan decided his empire needed a writing system, he didn't invent one, he borrowed it from a neighboring Turkic people called the Uyghurs, who had their own sophisticated written culture. The Uyghurs still exist today. They're a Muslim minority in northwestern China, and the Chinese government has spent the last decade systematically attempting to erase their culture and language. There's a painful irony in the fact that the people who gave the Mongol Empire its written voice are now fighting just to preserve their own. The steppe itself in the 12th century was not a civilization. It was dozens of warring tribes with no common law, no shared identity, constantly preying on each other. If you were born into a weak tribe, you were prey. Temujin, the man who would become Genghis Khan, was born around 1162 into exactly that kind of weakness. His father was poisoned by rivals when he was still a boy, so his family, he was abandoned by his own clan. As a teenager, he was captured and enslaved. Basically, there wasn't a big future for him. He escaped, however, and over 3 decades, through military genius, strategic alliances, and a willingness to break every tribal rule everyone else was playing by, he unified the Mongol people for the first time in history, and in 1206, he was declared the universal ruler, Genghis Khan. What followed was the fastest territorial expansion the world had ever seen. At its peak, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the doorstep of Eastern Europe, more land than Rome, more land than Alexander the Great, under a single ruler in a single lifetime. But here's what gets lost in the headlines. He didn't just conquer territory, he governed it, and the way he governed it was radical for the 13th century. He outlawed inherited privilege. He promoted based on merit. He issued a written law code that applied to everyone equally, including himself. And in an era defined by religious warfare, he guaranteed freedom of religion across his entire empire. He also understood that trade was power. The Mongol Empire created what historians call the Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace. For nearly a century, the Silk Road was safer than it had ever been. Merchants, diplomats, and ideas traveled freely from China to Eastern Europe. He even built the world's first international postal relay system, stations every 25 miles across the entire empire. The same trade routes, though, that carried silk and spices and also carried the bubonic plague into Western Europe. The Black Death killed 1/3 of Europe's population within a decade. Globalization, then, as now, cuts both ways. And in a lot of ways, Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire invented globalization. And that's really where my takeaways from the book come in, is off of that is that and that's kind of the idea behind this book is that if you think back to where we are at today in the era of taking over other countries and globalizing everything, the Mongols under Genghis Khan kind of invented that because of the way that they did things, right? It was very unique at the time in that he would conquer territories and people, and essentially his only ask, quote unquote, was serve him, serve his people. In your area, you could still choose to live however you wanted to live. You could have your own religion. You could live the way you wanted to live. You could still be there, but you were following under the Mongol rule. I kind of think about it like the United States. We're all a part of the United States, but truly all 50 states are very different. They all have their own governor. There's vast differences between, for example, Washington State and Texas, or Oregon and Oklahoma. I mean, it's a totally different way of life in those areas, and that's kind of how I think of the way he did this. It, again, was just very radical back then. The other things that I found with this book, and I did not know much about him prior to reading it, was the way he operated and in terms of taking over territories or warfare, which was, again, very unique. You know, they would do things like they would scout out the territories that they were planning to invade to make sure that there was water enough for their animals, or to make sure that they had places to camp out and set tents up. It sounds weird to think about that now, right, with revisionist history, but back then the idea was you got your army, we got our army, we march them up against one another. That's not the way they did that. If, for example, they were going to go invade a territory that was walled up, what they would do instead is they would take the main road and they would camp out on that main road and they would allow no one in. So think about what that city would have to do over time. You can't get any goods in, you can't get anything out. Eventually, you're going to have to succumb to the people that are outside, and Genghis Khan and their tribe could wait. Whereas others would attack, they would lose a bunch of people, they would lose a bunch of resources. It's just a different way of going about things, and it was very unique at the time. And again, it all kind of comes back to this idea of creating this massive globalization, and that's really what this book is about and how he made the modern world. And it's not so much that, like, there's nothing necessarily today that reminds us of the Mongols, or there's actually a lot, and he talks about, the author himself talks about in the beginning of the book how his personal journey was going to find like artifacts of Genghis Khan and the Mongols, which are hard to find, not only because it's from so long ago, but because the territory of Mongolia is very, very secretive and they do not let a lot of people in. But anyways, kind of getting back to my point, is it's not like there's a lot of markings on today's society. It's just sort of the concepts and the idea of he invented what is now considered the way the world works. And if you think about here in 2026 with what's going on with the US and Iran, Russia and Ukraine, right? Probably China and Taiwan at some point. I mean, it all kind of goes back to these ideas. And so the last thing that I'll leave you guys with that made me think about is you know, there's so much going on in today's world, especially in the Western world, of how a lot of young people today, especially on these big college campuses, want to make it seem like America in particular was the first conquerors ever. In America were invaders, and they are on stolen land. Books like this are such a good reminder that, not saying good or bad, right? I'm not saying that, but that's the history of peoples. Peoples in general, we are deeply flawed, and we conquer, we expand, we meddle, we're constantly looking for more. America didn't invent that, the British didn't invent that. It goes back centuries to tribes like the Mongols, and they're not the only one, that were invading and trying to add to their empire for growth. And it's history like this that I think is so critical for people, especially young people today, to read and understand these things, because of that concept that we tend today to live in the now and these current events and think like, oh my gosh, you know, Americans are invaders. This isn't even their land, the United States. And we paint this with a broad brush of like, that's how all Europeans were. And it's been like this forever. Not saying it's good or bad. It's just the way things have always been. And we see it continue today with the things I just referenced, right? I mean, literally, this is what Russia is doing with Ukraine right now, trying to take that territory because it's theirs, quote unquote. So that's the book, Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World. It's a solid one. It's a dense read because it's so old. They're relying on so much history, but I think you'll like it if you're a history fan. Thanks for watching.